listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
Rootbound is flourishing thanks to chlorophyll, the magical chemical that helps green plants turn sunlight into food. Now that's what I call a light meal!
Hi, everybody. I'm Steve, and this is my podcast. You probably already knew that. It's about plants for when you're stuck inside, and each week I invite a guest who joins me on the show to share with us all about a plant that means something to them, and then I share with a guest about a plant that means something to me, and through this process, we can all learn more about plants and learn more about each other. Now, here at the top of the show, before we meet our guest, I was thinking today about genuses, or genera, I think is the proper plural term for that classification of living things. I was thinking about genera, because, well, the plant that I talk about later, I was surprised that the genera is named after a person, and I think that happens a lot. There's these plant genera, or the genuses, that we might know those names, and they're so synonymous with the plant or the animal that we don't realize that they're named after a person. That happens a lot. I think I mentioned in this episode that like Carl Linnaeus, I feel like, was just like naming plants after like everybody he knew at one point. And so I figured I'd look up a list of maybe some common plants that you may or may not know are named after people. So magnolia, that is just synonymous with a plant, but that is named after a French botanist named Pierre Magnol, or probably Magnol. I don't know that French pronunciation, but yes, magnolia is named after a guy. Fuchsia, I was surprised, is named after a German botanist named Leonhard Fuchs, Fuchs. So it should be like fuchsia, I guess. It would be more accurate than fuchsia. Dahlias are named after a Swedish botanist named Anders Dahl. And then bougainvillea is named after another French guy who was apparently an explorer named Louis Antoine de Bougainville. So, and there's a lot more. I think it's a ton, but those are ones that just popped out to me that I was like, oh, those are named after people. I had no idea. And then I was thinking, well, these are all kind of historical people. Who is like, are there any people who are like alive today, modern times, who have whole genuses of plants named after them? And I started looking up, and it turns out, there's probably more than this, but the one that stood out to me is there is a species of small tree that was discovered in 2013 in Gabon, and that genus name is Cerdavidia, which is named after, can you guess it? Sir David Attenborough.
If left to themselves, the plants would completely take over.
Hi, Ryan. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Rootbound.
Thanks for having me.
Do you have a plant to share with us today?
I do. My plant is the Syngonium podophyllum.
Syngonium podophyllum.
Yep.
Okay. I have not even heard of that genus before. I don't know. Where do we start? I normally ask like why people chose to plant, but first let's maybe just get into like what it is, because I don't know what it is at all, and maybe the audience needs to visualize it before we hear why it's meaningful to you.
The Syngonium podophyllum is commonly referred to as the arrowhead vine, arrowhead plant, sometimes goosefoot, based on the shape of the leaves. It's really it's a typical house plant. Honestly, it's what it comes down to.
Okay. Starting to think about it a little bit more. When you said goosefoot, I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
There's a very common weed called goosefoot, but very unrelated. Okay, cool. Say the name one more time.
Syngonium podophyllum.
Syngonia podophyllum. And what do you call it normally? What's your common name for it?
Typically, I call it the arrowhead plant.
Arrowhead plant. All right, cool. All right. Tell me about this plant. Why is it meaningful to you?
This plant specifically is meaningful to me. So my mother received one of these as a gift when I was born back in 87. she has kept it alive all this time. It is the same plant that I pulled a propagation off of a couple years ago, and is the plant that I currently have in my house. So it is.
Wow.
It is what we refer to as my sibling plant in my family.
Wow. Oh, wow. That's so cool. Wow. That's such a cool thing about plants, of like how long lived they can be. And when you start getting into propagation, it starts to be like even more like, what plant, what's a plant,
Right.
what's the same plant. So is the original one, the one that's like in the soil, that's still at your mom's house too?
Yeah, still living, still trekking on. She's pulled a bunch of propagations off of it over the years. We've taken pretty good care of ours, and we've even propagated it off of a handful of times. It's very bushy at this point.
Wow, that is, yeah, very cool. And how big is the original one after being, this is like 30 some years old here?
That one, it's not super big. It has come and gone. It's ebbed and flowed as far as successful living is concerned. Sometimes it has appeared to be almost dead, and then it's come back miraculously. But it is still alive. It's more of a vine at this point. Hers is. So you can propagate it several times to make it more bushy. But as it ages, it either vines, it either climbs or it trails, depending on which way you sort of train it. She has sort of trained it to trail a little bit.
Do you ever find yourself like identifying with a plant, and when you see that it's like not doing well? I don't know. It seems like, oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah, this particular plant, just sort of hindsight, looking at its lifetime, I go, oh wow, that's similar to myself, I guess. It's it's ebbs and flowed as far as its survival, I suppose, through the years, and it's a pretty hardy plant. So in a way, I look up to it for its survivability.
Very interesting. Wow. Well, we're not talking about my plant yet, but there's a couple things about the plant that you chose that are just coincidentally very similar to the plant that I chose. So that happens a lot. This is very interesting. Okay. Let's talk maybe a little bit about some fun facts and dazzling details. Like, what can you tell us about this plant? Where's it from? What's its deal?
It is originally from Latin America, so anywhere between Mexico and Bolivia. It is sort of naturalized in like Texas, Hawaii, Florida, like the warmer states. And then it's really just a very popular, tropical houseplant. It's supposed to flower. I think it's very closely related to the peace lily. Its flower, if and when it does flower, it looks very much like the peace lily's flower. Typically, the houseplants, since they're indoor, they don't ever flower. It's very rare that they do. I don't think my mother's has ever flowered. Honestly, researching this plant recently, I learned that it flowers, which makes sense. It's a plant. You would think it would flower at some point, but the fact that I've never seen this thing flower over 30 plus years.
Have you ever flowered?
I like to think that I'm the indoor plant. It'll get there eventually.
Very good. Sorry, I was drawing too many connections between the person and the plant. That's really interesting. Yeah. I think that's a really interesting thing with houseplants. We've talked about that a bunch on the show. Is most houseplants are tropical plants, and that's because they're in the canopy of the forest, and so they can deal with low light because they're used to it. And they also seem to all have this really good ability of like holding off their flowering until the right time, because if you don't want to flower if you're down on the floor of the jungle, so you're climbing or you're trying all these different strategies to like wait to flower the right moment. And because of that, indoors it's just always like you're in the canopy. Yeah, it's so interesting. These plants have like a different mode of living when they're a house plant versus in the wild. Or it's very interesting.
Yeah, it's a very hardy plant. It's over 30 plus years. My mother's hasn't died. It's almost died. It's bounced back every single time. It's unkillable, I think, at this point.
And the same is going through for the propagation that you have at your place?
Yeah, it propagates wonderfully. If you pull it off, just under a node, stick in some water for about a week or two, it's, roots galore. It can even, I think, survive in just water. As long as you switch the water out every couple of weeks, it'll grow just fine. We have some propagations going at the moment that are just putting off leaves on their own because we just haven't moved them to soil yet.
How old is the main one that you have now at your house?
The one I have is probably, I would say, about 2 to 3 years old at this point.
Cool. Okay, here's another interesting thing about houseplants. I talked to some guests a while back. Do you name your houseplants?
No, I've never been one to like name plants or like cars or the normal things that people name. Just never been mine.
What? And then what you said earlier, like how you refer to the plant that's at your mom's house, because it doesn't have a name. It's not like Ryan 2 or something.
Right.
But you call what you said you called when you refer to it. What do you say?
My human siblings tend to refer to it as my sibling plant or my twin plant or whatever they want to call it. Because it's she got it while she was in the hospital when she gave birth to me, so it's literally been somewhere nearby my entire life.
Wow, so cool. That's so cool. Do your other siblings have sibling plants, or are you like the special
I am
one?
the special one. I think I'm the favorite of the family. They would probably agree with that.
Yeah, definitely a favorite of the plant. Very, very interesting. Do you have any other fun facts or dazzling details about this plant?
Something I learned while doing research for this. Apparently, it's poisonous. I had it's like very toxic. To like dogs, cats, people. It's
okay, good.
There's like a very specific cell in it, oxalate something. It's just like the
oxalates.
Yeah, just the build of it is like very sharp crystals, and ingesting it will essentially slice up whatever it touches. So it's very poisonous.
Yes.
Had not realized that, given the fact that this plant my entire life has always been relatively low to the ground, that dogs, cats, and children can reach.
So far, so good.
So far, so good.
Do you have any pet? Do you have any pets? Any cats, dogs?
Oh, we have 2 dogs. 2 dogs.
Okay, and they don't care about the plant.
They don't seem to
eat the plant.
They don't seem to eat this one. They like the herbs on the deck. They don't seem to super enjoy eating the houseplants. So that's good.
That's good. Yeah. That's my struggle as the audience who's listened to the show knows that I don't have a ton of houseplants because you can see one of the cats in the background. I have 3 cats, and they are pretty fascinated with them, and so I do have to avoid. I mean, I've had some people say that like when you get a houseplant that is like toxic, most of the time cats, if they even take a little bite, they are done, and they don't try to swallow it.
One and done.
But still, I don't want to risk it. So I have to try to find the cat safe houseplants, and they're few and far between, and then you have ones that are cat safe but also are cat attracting. They like to destroy them. So there's a small window of houseplants that I have, but so I guess I'll be avoiding the arrowhead plant though, unfortunately. if
yeah. I mean, it's not all negative. It is symbolic in feng shui, the arrowhead plant, because the way that the leaves grow, it starts out as a juvenile, they look like arrowheads. As they grow, they get more of a lobed shaped. So like the leaves are eventually like a 5-leaf lobe look as they get much older. A lot of the ones you buy in stores are arrowhead plants. Well, they're shaped like arrowheads because they're like young juvenile plants. But they eventually...
I'm going to Google this right now.
They eventually have this 5-leaf lobe look, which in feng shui is said to represent the 5 elements. So it like brings positive energy into your house. So you can balance that with
interesting. So
you can balance that out with the poisonous aspect of it.
Yeah, that's totally cool. So that's very interesting. The plant, the one that's your sibling plant. Is it like mostly 5-lobed leaves now because it's an old plant, or does that kind of ebb and flow? How does that work with the leaves?
A lot of it actually is the larger 5-lobed leaves, which through my life I thought it was a different plant being potted in the same pot, but after like looking at it closer, like it's the same plant. There are still some arrowhead shaped leaves growing off of it. The new ones that are growing, but there are a decent number of the lobed ones.
And then the younger plant, the 3-year-old under your house, what is it like? Is it more?
It's all arrowhead at this point.
Interesting. That's so cool. So I guess it takes a while for that process to happen.
Yeah, it seems to be a pretty slow growing plant. It propagates fast, but the growth and the maturity of it, I think, is very slow.
That's super interesting. You probably don't know the answer to this, and it's okay, and maybe the audience does. I wonder why. Why does a plant's leaf change shape like that over time? I'm thinking about a plant that I haven't talked about in the podcast yet, called porcelain berry, and it starts off looking like a grape leaf, but over time it also comes into this like 5-lobed leaf. And there's some other plants that I think do that over time. Their leaves change shape, and I wonder why.
It's interesting. I don't know if it's like a sunlight, like pulling in sunlight, like the roots are stronger, doesn't need like the brighter color. I don't know. I'm just gonna
maybe if you're that's an interesting theory. Like as it gets older, it doesn't need to photosynthesize as much, or maybe there's some advantage to. That's it. That's an interesting question. Audience, if you're smarter about plants than me, let me know, because that's interesting. It seems to be something that happens. I think also, Monstera does that as well. It can get the Swiss cheese holes over time. Interesting question. Maybe I'll find the answer to that someday. Very cool.
Plants, wild.
You're not the first person to be outshined by a sibling.
Thank you for sharing about your sibling plant with me. Do you mind if I share a plant with you?
Would love to.
So, like I said, there's some interesting similarities between these two plants. In some ways, they're very different. But the two things that I think they're similar is, I didn't know that yours was called Arrowhead Plant. When you sent me the name, I only read like the scientific thing. I didn't read anything else. But the plant I chose is called Ironweed. So you could have Ironweed and Arrowhead. They have this kind of like, metallurgical connection, which is interesting. And then the other thing is this plant is also known as being very resilient. That's, in fact, some ways, some of the reasons why it's called Ironweed has to do with how tough it is. Both actually physically in some cases, which I'll describe it in a second here, but also just like it grows anywhere and is very resilient. So the reason I chose Ironweed, have you ever seen Ironweed before? Are you familiar with Ironweed?
I'm going to Google search this while you're talking.
Yeah. You'll probably find the right one. There's a few plants called ironweed, but I'm talking about Vernonia genus. And specifically, I think the ones that grow in my yard, and that's why I chose it, they grow in my yard, are called Vernonia novaboracensis. I chose this plant because, like I said, it grows in my yard, and it's one of the ones when we got this house that it just popped up. And I was like, what are you? You're really interesting. And it's super interesting because it's super tall. It grows 9 feet tall. And it kind of, when it was first growing, I'm like, is this some kind of sunflower? What's going on here? And it is in the family Asteraceae, so it is related to sunflowers and daisies and all those flowers like that. And it grows pretty similar to a sunflower, except the flowers are these small purple flowers, and they're really beautiful, little purple puffs. The shape of the stem is pretty similar to a sunflower, or a little bit more like a Jerusalem artichoke, which I talk about in a couple episodes. Do you grow Jerusalem artichokes? I know you've got some cool like miniature homestead stuff going on over there at Teal House on the Hill.
I don't think
do you grow those?
I don't think we have artichokes yet. It'll go on the list eventually.
Highly recommended. Jerusalem artichokes. In fact, I should call them sunchokes. By the way, I keep meaning to tell the audience they're sunchokes. They're not an artichoke. They're like a potato. Google them. They're awesome. They're super easy to grow. Side note, I'm just a big fan of those plants. So anytime people are growing stuff, I like to recommend those. But the stem kind of looks like that, a little bit like a sunflower. But the greens of the ironweed are much darker than most of the other plants around it. So it kind of stands out. It has this darkish, maybe a little bit of a bluish tinge to the green. So that's kind of interesting look. Like I said, they can get 6 to 9 feet tall. Right now, the ones they're perennial, so they come back every year. So they grow up that full 9 feet every year from the rhizome, which is very impressive, like every single season from the same spot. And right now, they're maybe about 3 feet tall, but by the end of the season, they'll be super tall. And then they're really cool plant. I like them a lot because, and this is something audience, I've been following Ryan and Audrey, who you remember from a few episodes ago, their project Teal House on the Hill. And Ryan, you're a journeyman beekeeper, I guess to say.
Yes. Very newly.
I am also. So I'm also a beekeeper, and one thing you'll learn, Ryan, as you journey into your beekeeping ways, is you start to like learn more about the flowers. Like you start looking at flowers the way bees look at flowers. And one of the most important kinds of flowers for bees are the ones that bloom in the fall, because when you want the food sources, and that's the time when they really need to store up their honey for the winter, and ironweed is one of those. It blooms in the fall, kind of right at the end of right at the end of summer when there's starting to be a nectar dearth. It's one of the really key sources of nectar for honeybees, but also like all pollinators. It's a really important source for a lot of native pollinators as well, which is super cool.
Yeah, I'm looking at photos of these, and they look a bit like asters. It's like the first thing I like.
Yes.
A New England aster, sort of purple daisy like. I'll have to add them to my wildflower list that I plan on growing.
Yeah, and they might, there's a number of different species within the genus, and I don't know which one is more like naturalized to where you're at. This one, which I'm talking about, Vernonia nova boracensis. Let's talk about that name really quick. I like talking about scientific names. Vernonia is named after a guy named William Vernon. So that happened a lot. I think this is one of the ones that Carl Linnaeus just like got a list of like botanist dudes, and it was just like, okay, you get this one, you get this one, you get this
Spread
one,
them
you get
out,
this one. So William Vernon was a 17th century botanist who collected plants in Maryland, which is just up, over the border from where I live, which is kind of cool. The last name Nova boracensis, when I first read this up, they were like, well, Nova boracensis means New York, and the other name for this plant is New York ironweed. But I'm like, wait, how does Nova boracensis mean New York? And okay, Nova I get, Nova Latin for new, but boracensis, and apparently, and it took me a while to find this one, that there's a Roman fort in Britain that was called Eboracum, which eventually became the town of York in England. So Nova boracensis literally means New York.
Oh, wow.
Those botanists get clever with their name. They didn't just want to call it the Vernonia New Yorkia or something. They gotta be fancy.
Can't be straightforward with it.
Totally. Okay, so why it's called ironweed? I have a few different sources for this, but the main one, there's an article by Terry W. Johnson from Go Georgia Wildlife that says, after blooming, the seed heads turn a rusty brown. Some say that is the reason the plant is called ironweed, because the seed heads look like rusted iron. But others suggest the plant gets its name from its tough stems and long taproot. And the stems are quite tough. Like they're tall, but I feel like they're not as like maybe brittle as some of those other tall flowers like that. They're pretty sturdy. So that's that. There are some traditional medicinal uses apparently, but the sources on that I'm not always like can deep dive in those. But so there's people who have used teas and stuff. But listener beware. Don't drink things just because I said that has been used as tea. Let's see here. Speaking of that, I have this thing which I will read. And like I said, audience. Disclaimer as far as medicinal uses. I just like this description because it had a lot of things I did not understand. This is from a book called The American Eclectic Dispensatory from like 1800 and something. And it says its property and uses. I'm going to try to read this now and just like count in your head, listener, and Ryan, how many of these words you do not know what they mean, because I didn't know a lot. Okay, ironweed is a bitter tonic, decobstruent, and alterative. In powder or decoction, the root is beneficial in amenorrhea, dysmenorrhea, leukorrhea, or menorrhagia. In intermittent, remitted, and bilious fevers, the decoction or a saturated tincture has been recommended, said to have been useful in scrofula and some cutaneous diseases. The decoction, 1 or 2 fluid ounces of the tincture, 1 or 2 fluids, blah blah blah. Anyway, those are the words. All those rheas and scrofula. I don't know what those are.
I think I counted 10. 10 words I didn't know.
Okay. yeah. Anyway, I thought it was like just one paragraph that has a lot. It also apparently makes an excellent discutient application to tumors.
Excellent.
Whatever that means. Yeah. Anyway, audience who knows their vocabulary better than me, feel free to let me know. I didn't have time to Google every single word in that old book. It's one of the older references I found to the book. I always like trying to go back and Google books to find old references, and that was a good one. I forget the year.
I love an old description of botany of like, you can make this into a tea, but do you want to?
Totally.
Like, you could boil this in water for a while and make a tea, but
yeah, and there probably are some properties, but interestingly about this plant, it seems to be a fairly unstudied plant. Like, there's not a ton of information about it, and the Google stuff is kind of all the same sources repeating each other. And that's always interesting when that happens, because this is a plant that is not like overtly edible. Like, there are some medicinal uses, but humans, I think, stop like paying attention to plants if we don't find them immediately useful. And this is one that I think just, in some places people call it a noxious weed because it grows really well, but it's native to like large swaths of the United States. So I don't think it's ever fair to call it a weed. But yeah, so there's not too much about it out there. So I was trying to find some more fun facts and dazzling details, and there's really not a ton. But the one that I found, and this is where I'll close this kind of part of the episode, when I was Googling ironweed, one thing kept coming up over and over again, and there's a novel by William Kennedy that came out in 1983 that won a Pulitzer Prize, and the book is called Ironweed, which is interesting. And also interesting, it was made into a movie in 1988 starring Jack Nicholson and Meryl Streep, and they're both nominated for Academy Awards for this movie, Ironweed. And the movie seems kind of depressing. It's like they're both kind of like down on their luck people during the Depression. And I think, well, I know for a fact here, the ironweed apparently is never said in the book. Like, there's no references to ironweed in the book, except for the first page of the book has this very simple description that says, tall ironweed is a member of the sunflower family. It has a tall, erect stem and bears deep purple-blue flower heads in loose terminal clusters. Its leaves are long, thin, and pointed. Their lower surface is downy. Its fruit is seed-like with a double set of purplish bristles. It flowers from August to October in damp, rich soils from New York south to Georgia, west to Louisiana, north to Missouri, Illinois, and Michigan. The name refers to the toughness of the stem. And I read several places that, literary analysis says that the ironweed flower symbolizes the main character Francis Phelan's resilience and survival despite the harsh circumstances of his life. So that's why it was called ironweed, apparently.
That makes sense now.
Yeah. It took me a while to figure it out. I was like, why is this book called Ironweed? Like,
what's the metaphor there?
And it was like filling my Google results, but I couldn't. I was just like, what is? It's like the Depression and like, but yeah, it's those literary types.
I like the metaphor though. It's pretty great once you understand it. It makes sense. The toughness yet beauty of the ironweed. Yeah,
and I guess some people mentioned that because it's the New York ironweed, like the book takes place in Albany, New York, and that plant would have been a very common plant in that area, and particularly during the Depression in places where like things had been like not developed for a while, or like disturbed areas or stuff that had been run down. Ironweed is a very fast. It shows up in those places quickly, right, where things have been disturbed and or have like been run down. So interesting, really cool plant. I really love it. Great for the bees. It's in part of my yard I'm trying to like turn into a little native flower bed, and it just was just there, and it's really cool, and it's really nice to see how tall it gets in the end of the year.
I'll have to add it to I'm trying to do the same thing. It's a work in progress at the moment. My wildflower garden habitat. I'll definitely add this to the list then. Especially if it's tall,
cool,
and
the bees.
I can put it in the back.
Yes, that's everyone who is. I'm not as like a good of a like horticulturist like that, but everywhere I read about it, as far as for like landscaping, they're like, put it in the back of your beds because it really makes a nice backdrop. And then also just be aware, if you are going to grow it, you want to make sure you it spreads mostly via rhizome, so it can really like take over. So you want to like clip away the younger ones if they're kind of getting away from where you don't want it to be. And they also said that if you care about this, maybe you don't, but you could clip the seed heads off if you don't want the seeds to spread, because that's the way the seeds just fall off this tall stalk. Or actually, the way that it naturally works, and Mine's in kind of a thing surrounded by my driveway, so this is not much of an issue, but the way that I think it spreads in the wild is those tall stems fall over. And so now it spreads itself 9 feet away from where it was, right? And so, like the seeds. But I think it mostly spreads via the rhizomes. I think that, the seeds are not a primary way of, like, spreading, or I don't know. Or maybe, they're not the primary way. A lot of those, the sunchoke, which you mentioned, is like a 2. It has flowers and seeds, but the seeds aren't very often fertile. It's mostly via this rhizomatic spread.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's ironweed.
I love it.
Vestron Video proudly presents Ironweed, based on William Kennedy's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, starring Academy Award winners Jack Nicholson and Meryl Streep.
You got nowheres to go. You want to get knocked over the head? Huh?
Living minute to minute, tenderly drawing on each other for the friendship and courage they need to survive.
You forget when you were hungry and you came to my place begging for food. Oh, I never asked you for a sandwich.
David Anson of Newsweek says Jack Nicholson commands the screen with the authority one associates with the great stars of the past.
She's gonna drop dead in the street someday if she keeps wandering off like that.
She needs you. What do you need, friend?
I think I need a shoelace.
Meryl Streep, as ever, is uncanny, says Janet Maslin of the New York Times.
He's me pal, he's me pal. There ain't nobody else I can see.
They are incredible. They make Ironweed a must-see film, says Joel Siegel of WABC TV.
I'd rather have him and his 15 a week than be some old millionaire's gal. He's the best.
A unique and unforgettable film. They are two of the greatest actors on the planet, says Peter Travers of People magazine. Jack Nicholson, Meryl Streep, Ironweed, nominated for 2 Academy Awards, Best Actor and Best Actress.
Well, that was a fun episode talking about the Arrowhead Plant and Ironweed with Ryan. If I get around to watching the full movie Ironweed, I will give you a little review, maybe in my newsletter, which you can sign up for at rootboundpodcast.com. I haven't put out many newsletters, but I'm going to start doing it monthly, so check in for that. Also, I tried to figure out why the leaves of certain plants change shape as they age, and I was Googling. I wasn't very successful, so if you know that answer to that or have some theories, send them my way. It's something I'd really like to do. I think I got to dig deeper because, like, the normal Google layer of results was not giving me any clues. Anyway, I think that's the end of the show. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on the next episode. My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Ryan Rimley. Ryan is a copywriter and marketer. He's also half of the Instagram account Teal House on the Hill. You remember Audrey from a few episodes ago? She's the other half. And he's also one of the co-hosts of the podcast Please Be Prompt, which you can find wherever you get your podcasts. There will also be links to all that stuff in the show notes. If you like Rootbound and you want to help support the show, visit rootboundpodcast.com/support to find all the ways you can support the show, including signing up for the newsletter, which I am trying to commit here that I will put out at least once a month. Rootbound is hosted by the Jack Nicholson of plant podcasts, Steve Ellington. Music by Christian Kriegesgota. Fake ads by David Lonnie. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, but if you can go outside, try to think of all the plants around you as your siblings.
Rootbound is flourishing thanks to chlorophyll, the magical chemical that helps green plants turn sunlight into food. Now that's what I call a light meal. Huh? Light meal. Anyway.